Welcome to the Beeson Podcast, coming to you from Beeson Divinity School on the campus of Samford University. Now your host, Doug Sweeney.
Welcome to the Beeson Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Sweeney, and I'm joined today by my friend, Dr. Gerald Bray, Beeson's Research Professor of Divinity. Dr. Bray has been a staple here at Beeson Divinity School for many years. He teaches in the area of historical theology. For a long time, he served as our Anglican Chair of Divinity, and he continues to teach very profitably for us. He also continues to serve as a prolific author, and he's recently released yet another new book entitled A Companion to the Book of Common Prayer, which we want to introduce you to today. So, Dr. Bray, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we all know this isn't the first time you have been on the Beeson Podcast. But having said that, I don't want to presume that everybody listening now knows about you already. So why don't we begin by introducing you to them? Tell us just a little bit about how you became a Christian, how you became involved in ministry, and what got you all the way to Beeson Divinity School.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Well, I was born and brought up in a church-going family, which was a great blessing for me because I went to Sunday school from a very early age, and unlike a lot of people, I took to it. I really liked it, and the particular Sunday school that I went to was very strict, not the sort of kindergarten stuff that you get nowadays. We had to memorize large chunks of the Bible.
Good for you.
Yes, I had to memorize the whole of Romans, Ephesians, and other New Testament books, one chapter at a time.
Nice.
And we were catechized, and it was a very serious business. And I'm talking about when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. I mean, not even a teenager. And so I had a very good foundation in that way. But like a lot of people, I suppose, who are brought up in the church, it's very difficult to know how much of it is something that you take for granted because that's the way you've been brought up, and how much of it is really personal to you. And I had all the background and so on, but it was when I was about 14 or so that I remember hearing somebody talk about being born again as a Christian, and I wasn't terribly sure what that meant in particular. But afterwards I was thinking about it, and I went home and I read my Bible, and I found in Matthew's Gospel where Jesus was talking about to the Pharisees about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it was actually the Sadducees, I said, rather than the Pharisees, because the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. And so, and Jesus said, well, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he is the God of, not the God of the dead, but of the living. And although this was completely out of context, and it's not what the Bible verse means, it struck me in a way that suddenly I woke up and thought, I'm dead. I'm one of the dead. And I don't know why it hit me that way, but it did. And I got on my knees and I just asked the Lord to come into my life and make it real for me. And that's how that happened. And of course I had all the background, so I knew what it was all about. But yes, and the thing that I discovered when that happened, of course, my life changed in ways that I didn't really realize at the time because, I was only a teenager, and of course you just go on living, you don't really think about those things very much, but other people noticed. And I suddenly discovered hostility from people, particularly within my own family. People, well, you see, there are people who are quite happy that I should go to church as a child, but church was something you grew out of, as you got older, that was all right for a time, but you move on. And I didn't. And so this wasn't regarded very highly. And then when I chose my sort of higher educational aims and so on. Other people were trying to turn me into a lawyer or something like this. You see, someone who would make a lot of money, and I wasn't going that way, and that was a difficulty that I had to confront. Not anything that I invited. I mean, I wasn't deliberately obnoxious or anything like that. It was just that this is what happened. It came to me, as it were, that sort of opposition, and I had to struggle against it. But in my early years as a Christian, my fellowship and support came mainly from parachurch organizations, Christian fellowship at school, high school, and then in university. And again, I was very well placed because I happened to find myself among a group of people who were very good Christian people and dedicated. And I'm still in touch with many of them, and some of them have gone on to great things. And, it's quite astonishing when your teenage companions suddenly become famous. Yeah. And
did you go to university intending to do ministry vocationally, or you weren't sure?
No, well, I wasn't sure, because I went to university and I read classics, the Latin and Greek, which of course is a great foundation for that. Mm-hmm. And no, I wasn't particularly thinking of ministry. In fact, I didn't really know what I was going to be doing. But it was after I graduated from university that I then went to do doctoral studies in Paris. And it was when I was in Paris that I actually joined a church as an adult for the first time. And it was there that I got a formation in church life as opposed to Sunday school or in an adult church life.
Yeah. Which church did you join?
I joined the English church in Paris, okay. the Anglican church there. Excellent ministry, and from there I went to Cambridge to study theology. It was more directed then, but I still wasn't terribly sure about ministry, or what I would end up doing. But it was in the summer jobs that I had and so on, and mixing with ordinary people, not academic type people or church people particularly, that every once in a while someone would come up to me and say, "Oh, you're studying for the ministry, aren't you?" And I would say, "Well, no, not really." And they said, "But you're that type." And I thought, "Oh, what type is that?" And you kind of. But then gradually I realized that this was God's sort of way of indicating to me that there was something there that I needed to consider. And gradually it sort of dawned on me, and I did consider it, and I applied for ordination training and was ordained in 1978. And then I went to serve in a parish in London for 2 years in the docks of London, a completely different environment from what I'd ever done before. And it was when I was there that I was invited to go and teach at a college. I mean, I didn't ask for the invitation. In fact, I can honestly say all the jobs I've ever applied for, I never got. And all the jobs I've had have come to me.
Is that right?
Yes, right through my life. And this was one, you see. And I went to give a few lectures at the college. I don't know quite how they found out about me, but they did anyway. So I went, and the students got a petition up to have me come on the faculty. Yeah, so I got invited to.
It worked.
Yes, it worked. I know students say that the faculty never listened to them, but this was one case where that happened. Yeah. And I really liked it afterwards, because every time anyone complained about anything, I would just simply say, "Well, I didn't apply for this job. you gave it to me whether I wanted it or not." And so that was good. So I taught in London for 12 years. And then I was offered a research job in Oxford, but it was contingent on money. And you know, you know as well as I do, when things are contingent on money, anything can happen.
Right.
And so this was sort of hanging in the air for a bit. But I had some time on my hands, I suppose you'd have to say. And one day I got a fax came from Beeson Divinity School, of which I had never heard, asking me to come to Beeson for a semester to teach. So I thought, well, I can do that. This job is sort of up in the air, and it wasn't clear what was going to happen. So I accepted, and I came. It was.
Did you know anybody at Beeson at that time in your life?
Not a soul, and I had in fact been in Alabama before, but that was driving from Jacksonville, Florida to New Orleans. So I'd gone through Mobile, and that was as much of Alabama as I'd ever seen.
Okay.
So I had seen it before, and in 1990 I had been a visiting scholar at the General Theological Seminary in New York. So I did in fact have experience of living and working in an American seminary. And I was actually interim pastor of the oldest church in New York that's still functioning, which is the French congregation, Huguenot congregation, which has been there since 1628. So I did that.
You did that while you were teaching in New York?
While I was teaching in New York, yes. And it was very strange how these things work out, because in order to pay me, I had to get a Social Security card. So they gave me one of those. So I had that. And I had to open a bank account. That was another thing. You know, various things like this that I thought, well, I don't know what I'm going to do after I go back home. You know, what's going to happen here? But, you know, you get these things, you keep them in your pocket, and that's that. And then when I came to Beeson, of course, I had all this, you know, because they said, well, do you have a work permit? Do you have anything? I said, well, I've got all this, you know, documents and that. So they were quite happy about that. But I had no intention of staying. And it was after 3 weeks that the dean offered me a job. And I wasn't expecting it at all. And I turned him down initially because I said, well, I've got this other job that's sort of hanging, and I can't really just ignore that. But so we kind of left it hanging for a while. But then by a series of accidents, really, I suppose you'd have to say, but it's sort of, you know, God-governed accidents, the job in Oxford fell apart. The money wasn't there, basically.
Okay.
And it's a long story, but anyhow, I realized that this wasn't going to work. So I wrote to the people and also said, well, you know, we'll try to find the funding, blah, 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 come and we'll see what happens. And I said, well, actually, no, I'm going to say pull out of that for now. But I said, because it just didn't seem to be working properly. So then I went back to the dean at Beeson and said, well, I'm free now. I can come. So I did. And the first year at Beeson, I hated every minute of it. Not because of Beeson. I mean, Beeson was fine. But I was out of my comfort zone. I was in a strange place. I didn't know anybody, and I didn't have anything to do. And settling in a new place when you're not young anymore.
Sure. What year was this?
This was 1993.
93.
Yes, I came on the 1st of February, so it'll be it's just now 31 years since I arrived, and. My first semester at Beeson was the year of the big snowstorm. We had 14 inches of snow one night at spring break, and I was everybody was a prisoner on campus for an entire week.
Wow.
We couldn't get off. Yes, So I thought, well, I've seen Birmingham at its worst, which is true.
Yeah.
You know.
And you saw Beeson at a very early stage in its development.
Stage. We weren't in the present building.
Yeah.
No, it was very early. It was a very small school, and there was a real pioneer spirit about it.
Yeah.
And I look back on those days, and it's very difficult because from one point of view, you say, well, the school has grown and it's become, a much more solid thing than it was in those days, which is true. And of course, I'm very grateful to the Lord for that. And I think it's wonderful what's happened.
But it was also fun.
It was also fun.
Being here in the early years and being one of the pioneers.
Right. And also, we were much more closely connected to each other because it was sink or swim.
Yeah.
There was nothing to rely on. There was no reputation and so on.
Yeah. Who were the faculty then?
We had Ken Matthews, who's just retired, Frank Thielman, who's still here, Timothy George, of course, who is around, and then Richard Wells, who has gone away, and Fisher Humphreys was teaching.
Already in 93, he was here.
Yes, he was here. Teaching theology, and I think that was it really. The core.
Yeah.
And but we could club together, and we were very close in many ways. And we were on the opposite side of campus then. And I have to say, we were in a building which never flooded. So there were advantages.
That's right. Yes.
And so that was that. And I watched when the present building was being built. Mm. And I was, for better or for worse, the chair of the committee which chose what we call the Sweet 16, the people who were in the dome.
All right.
And so I got to know quite a lot about Beeson and, the way people think and so on. Mm-hmm. When we did that.
Were they calling you the Anglican chair already at that time?
Yes, I came as the Anglican professor of divinity. That was because Mr. Beeson had set that up. Mm-hmm. And so it was deliberate. But of course, there'd never been such a person before. And I was suspect from two angles. The university, which was at that time still much more Baptist than it is now, much more closely connected with the Alabama State Baptist Convention. And they wondered, what's this peculiar person coming here? Because it was because of Mr. Beeson, not any other reason. Yeah. And the Episcopal Church, which thought, who is this parish being parachuted in, from goodness knows where, because I didn't know any of them either. So I had to spend the first couple of years just reassuring people that, I wasn't as bad as they thought. Yeah. And
so after you got settled in, mid-90s, late 90s, you've always been somebody who's been pretty well known in academic circles. You publish a lot. You could have gone somewhere else.
Well, I was invited. I was pursued by various institutions, and I had to decide what to do, and that was a kind of crisis point in my own life, because I thought, well, what am I actually doing? Yeah. And I realized that in my own self that my career, such as it was a vocation, not a job. And one particular institution, I said, well, I've only been at Beeson a couple of years, and I don't feel I can leave them so soon. And they said, oh, well, we'll buy you out, if there's something like this. Yeah. And I thought, well, I'm not a commodity, I don't want to be bought out, thank you very much. And so I said, no, that's not right. I mean, if I'm committed to this place, it's my vocation, not my job. As it is a job in one sense, of course, but it's more than that. Yeah. And I appreciated very much what Beeson wanted to be. Yeah. An interdenominational evangelical School of Theology with a strong emphasis on pastoral training men and women for pastoral ministry, also for other things. I mean, we've trained people for academic, but it's a very sort of broad thing, but also a relatively small school, as schools go. And you could get to know everybody and so on. And that suited me just fine. You know, that's what I liked. And I managed to develop good relations with faculty, but also with students as they came and went. And I still maintain connections as far as I can with alumni.
Oh, sure.
And
I know that well.
yes, and
so in addition to, I know, you stuck around mostly because you felt like God wanted you here.
Yes,
you had
that's
a sense
right.
of calling to this place. From just a more mundane human point of view, what were some of the features about Beeson, even in the early years when it was pretty small and there was more, potential that hadn't yet been actualized yet? There was a vision and a hope. We were trying to become something, but hadn't quite done it yet. What kept you around?
well, the sense that one of the things that I was called to do was to further that vision. You do get people who will go somewhere and it's not what they were expecting. And so they turn around and walk away. And I think to myself, well, no, that's not the way you should do it. You see that, if it's not what you were expecting, well, it depends on the circumstances, of course. But in Beeson's case, we were still in the formative stages, formative years. And I said, but it has the potential to become, what I wanted it to be and what everybody wanted it to be. It wasn't just my eccentric idea. Whereas I said, if I walk away and say, well, it's not what I expected. I expected something far more developed. People would have looked and said, well, what do you expect? You were brought here in order to help it develop, and now you're running away from what you were called to do. And I thought, well, no, that's not right. I need to stay here and commit to working out this vision. And I felt it would be wrong to leave at that stage. It's the same, of course, with anything, and people get married and get tired of it after 2 or 3 years and they're not prepared to work at it. But you have to because it's a commitment. It's not, it's something you have to do. And I felt like that with Beeson, that if I'm just going to complain about it's not giving me what I want, or expect or something, and I'm not prepared to make my contribution, then I would be in the wrong. And I've always felt that, and ever since, we've been through our ups and downs, we've made our mistakes, I've made mistakes, and you have to turn around and say, well, yes, we tried that, and it didn't work, and we tried something else, and it didn't work. Okay, but that's not the end of life. You have to move on. And I look back now, after more than 30 years, and of course, what stands out and what, you see is how much has gone well and how much God has blessed us in different ways. When you're actually in it on a day-to-day basis, of course, it's very hard to judge this because you can't see the future. You don't know what's going to happen. But when you look back, and I look at some of the students I've known over the years and what they're doing now, many have gone on to very impressive careers, some of them quite prominent in academic or church life, others perhaps less prominent, but still very satisfying and successful. And others have gone into other walks of life, in different ways. But we reconnect. Just very recently, we had an alumnus come and preach in chapel, and a student whom I knew very well, of course, when he was a student. and I've kept up with over the years off and on. And we got together sort of secretly afterwards because it wasn't in the program that we were supposed to meet. But he came and found me, and we had a wonderful afternoon together. We just picked up where we left off last time, and there's a friendship, but there's a relationship which somehow goes deeper than that, because it's in the Lord and in the ministry and in the vocation that we share. And then I realize, well, this is what's been happening. This is the way it is. And so I look back and I feel now I've been here a long time, and the last couple of years there've been a lot of changes which were bound to happen. I mean, everything happens, it was going to happen anyway. And I'm glad to have been here to see it. Not that you don't have some regrets, of course, but we're all getting on, and things move on. And I say to people now, I said I'm in a very difficult time of life, and they said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I'm too old to have a regular job, but not old enough to be president." And so. What do you do? Sort of in a kind of no man's land, But I look through that and I think, what should I be doing? What should my main contribution be? And I think it's very much a ministry of encouragement to people, because I'm talking to people who are a third of my age.
Yeah.
I could be their grandparents, and in a way, I suppose I am. I sort of take, that's the way they would see me in some ways. But I can tell them, because, well, when you're young and something goes wrong in your life, it's a major tragedy, because you can't see where things are headed. If your engagement breaks up, or if your job falls apart or something like that, people can feel it very, very badly. And I get alongside people like that and I said, look, it's not the end of the world. God hasn't brought you this far in order to abandon you now. And seminary life is the time when things will be sorted out in your life. And that's the preparation. That's the real preparation for ministry.
Yes.
Because you may have brought baggage with you from wherever. I said, I don't know what it is, and I'm not trying to poke my nose into your affairs, but there may be issues that you have to sort out in your life, and this is the time to do it, so that you can go out prepared. And if God is closing one particular door or pointing you in a direction that you might not have previously considered, then this is the place for that,
right?
Where that should happen. And so I think that's a very, very valuable ministry and a very important thing. And to encourage people and say, well, it could be worse, but also it's going to be better. I mean, that you'll come through this, and you'll come through this stronger than you are. And I spend a lot of time listening to students preach. And try to help, to say how I feel about it and what so on.
And it means the world to a young preacher.
Absolutely.
When somebody at your stage of life is an encouragement.
Well, that's what I think. And I said, if I have to say something, say critical in some way, it's better that it come from me than it come from a board of deacons or somebody in the church who are going to fire you, know. I mean, well, strange things happen, you see. For instance, some people have the idea that they have to tell jokes in the pulpit to get the crowd, worked up. And all right, I mean, you can do that. I mean, I have a sense of humor, so I do that sometimes. But there's certain things you don't joke about. Right. And one of them is hell. And I remember hearing a sermon somebody preached on hell, and they made a joke of it. And I said, sorry, you can't do that. There are some subjects that are just too serious. And I mean, by all means, you use a sense of humor when it's appropriate. But in this case, it's not. And, you have to. This is the place where you can say that to people, and it's not the end of the world.
Right.
Yeah. So things like that.
Yeah. Oh, Gerald, your ministry here has just been immense. And I know very few people whose so-called retirement years have been as fruitful for the Lord, for the church, for the kingdom as yours have been. I mean, your ongoing interpersonal ministry to students, which we've just talked about, your ongoing teaching ministry, your ongoing writing ministry. It's been a tremendous blessing to us at Beeson, but to lots of other folks as well.
Well, yes, you see, I took early retirement not because I was fed up with teaching, but because I was fed up sitting on committees. And
there are many faculty members who relate to this right here.
That's right. Well, the reality of academic life now is that it's become much more bureaucratized than it used to be. And the higher up you rise, on the ladder, the more committees you end up sitting on, the more you do admin, rather than actual teaching in a classroom.
Work with the students.
Well, that's right. And so I thought, well, I don't really see myself doing this, and so I pulled back from that. And I mean, I'm still interested, of course, in what goes on in many ways, and I'm not trying to say that I won't do, administrative work if I'm asked to and I have to. That's fine, but it's given me time to write. It's given me time to to minister in different ways pastorally, and I wouldn't have been anything like as productive as I have been if I haven't done that.
Right.
And so I said, well, I've only got so much time on earth, and the time is running out, and redeem the time, said the scriptures.
Yes.
Count each day as if it's your last, and make sure that you are using it in the right way.
Yeah.
And that's what I've tried to do.
Thank you for doing it. One of the things we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation is that you continue to be a productive scholar and a writer. And even just since I've been here doing these podcast episodes, we've talked a few times about new books that you've published. The latest is a companion to the Book of Common Prayer. I bet most of our listeners have at least heard of the Book of Common Prayer before. Just for people who aren't Anglican, can you tell us a little bit about, so what is the Book of Common Prayer? Tell us a little bit about its history, and then we'll see what you're doing in this particular book here.
Well, the Book of Common Prayer, of course, was introduced in England in the mid-16th century. And it came about because the Reformation in England was different from the Reformation in other countries. In Germany with Martin Luther, in France or the French-speaking world with John Calvin and people like this, it was more of a kind of, I wouldn't say grassroots, because you wouldn't say Luther was the grassroots really, but it came from within the church itself and spread that way, and through preaching and teaching ministry and so on. And the people who were won to it were won by the preaching and teaching. That's why people became Lutheran or became Calvinist or whatever it is they became. Whereas in England, it wasn't. I mean, in England, the Reformation came about because the king wanted his marriage annulled, so that he could marry somebody else and have a son, have an heir to the throne. And so the complications resulting from that led him to break with the papacy, which wasn't prepared to annul his marriage in the way that he wanted it annulled. And England woke up the next day as a so-called Protestant country with no Protestants in it, or very few. And so right from the beginning, the Church of England, basically had to convert its own people, and it still does. I mean, that's what it is, and so you have to understand. They produced books of sermons to be preached because the priests in the church had no idea. They could barely read, never mind preach. And so they were given that to preach. The catechisms were devised, of course, where were you going to get these things? Well, mainly from Luther or from Calvin. I mean, they imported a great deal.
Sure.
And the prayer book was the same. I mean, most of it you can find has some kind of antecedent in other Protestant countries. But it was a teaching medium. It was meant to teach people how to pray. And this may seem odd to us, but you read the New Testament and, what did the disciples say to Jesus? They said, Lord, teach us how to pray. And it was when they said that he gave them the Lord's Prayer. And so this is something that has to be taught. And this is what the prayer book tries to do. Now, over the years, of course, various things have happened. I mean, some people have said, well, it's rote, repetition, vain repetition, people just saying things they don't mean, and it goes in one ear and out the other. So you get that reaction, rather than something spontaneous from the heart. You get other people who are wedded to it because it's 16th century English. You get other people who like it because to them it seems as if the Reformation never actually happened, which is a complete misunderstanding of what it was meant to do. And so it goes, you see, I mean, all kinds of arguments about it one way or another. And in the 19th century, this became divisive within the church itself. And people wrote commentaries on the Book of Common Prayer. There's even a dictionary, a prayer book dictionary, which was produced, and they represented different schools of thought. But from the evangelical standpoint, from the Reformed standpoint, the last book that did this, that actually guided people through the prayer book and pointed out what it was all about, was written in 1912. The second edition came out a year later in 1913 because it sold very well. And it was reprinted until 1963. It's gone out of print now. But that's all there was, you see. And
well, it's about time we have another.
Well, because there's been such a lot of liturgical revision and so on in the 20th century and recent times, ecumenical movement, a lot of the controversies that were raging 100 plus years ago have disappeared, or they've changed their character. And we're much more open to other things now. I mean, I'll give you one example where the prayer book is very much a child of its time. The baptismal liturgies, you see, there were two. There was one for the public baptism of infants and one for the private baptism of infants. Well, the people who devised the prayer book, they didn't believe in the private baptism of infants, but this was a compromise because a lot of people weren't prepared to go into the church and have their children baptized. So, they had to allow for that, even though they weren't terribly happy about it. And of course, at a day and age when infant mortality rates were extremely high, you couldn't necessarily wait even to Sunday. The child might not survive. So, you could see the logic behind it. But there was no rite of baptism for adults. And it was only in 1662, 12 years after the initial prayer book came out, that they put one in. Saying that we have to do this partly because of overseas expansion. And in the colonies, natives, adults are becoming Christian and they have to be baptized. And partly also because sectarian groups like Baptists and what have you were coming on the scene and they were not baptizing infants. And so, a rite for the baptism of adults was needed.
Is there a simple way to characterize the changes in the prayer book over the centuries? I think there are many lay people who know enough about the prayer book and its history to know there have been changes. And our ministers talk about various additions. And there's some controversy sometimes lying under the surface there. but they don't know much about these changes and
No.
how interested they should be in them.
Right.
What do they need to know about that?
Well, they need to know why the changes were made. I mean, I've just given you a case in point, you see, and how they should relate to this. Because today, of course, if you take the baptism question, everybody would agree, whatever denomination you are, that the baptism of adults is primary and the baptism of children is read off that as an extension. Which in the 16th, 17th century they didn't believe or they didn't realize. So that's one thing. The changes, yes, I mean, in the companion that I've written, I've detailed all the changes as they've occurred. And usually, well, it depends on what the changes are, but if, for example, a prayer or some particular thing has been altered partially, I will have the old wording in one font and the new wording in a different font,
Nice.
so that you can see immediately how it was altered, and follow on like that, and then an explanation as to what it actually meant and why. And so this is why it's called a companion to the Book of Common Prayer, because you can take the one that you've got in front of you now and go to this and see what the original was.
That's great.
And how it's moved on since then. Yes, I mean, you know, it's a very educative thing from that point of view. And it's mainly intended for students and pastors and interested lay people, you know, who want to or who need to, if they're ministering, know what the background is.
Yeah.
Because you get a lot of people that in total ignorance will say something or other, and they don't know.
Right.
You know, they just don't
Right.
know.
Even clergy.
Oh,
Yeah.
especially. I mean, that's the embarrassing thing, you see. And I don't blame them, because, I mean, you know, you're sitting in a class in seminary. What are the chances that your lecturer is going to tell you those things? Well, 50-50. What are the chances that you're going to remember it? Probably zero. You know, and so it's useful to have that.
It sure is. So what else are you doing for everybody in that volume? What else is in it?
It goes through all the services, and it shows the pattern of how, you know, it's laid out, how it's meant to really, it's meant to take a pattern of worship which originated in the medieval monasteries and adapt them for everyday use by ordinary people who were not monks. So you have your daily prayer, morning and evening. You have a regular scriptural reading, because it was only in the Reformation, people don't realize this, that, you know, regular Bible reading, starting with Genesis and ending up in Revelation, was actually developed. People were expected to read the Bible right the way through. It was only then that the Psalter came into use in the way that we're used to now. I mean, the Psalms, of course, were always there, but what they used to do was take out odd verses here and there, you know, and use them in the prayers and that. But the idea of reciting a complete psalm and going through them on a regular basis and making that, well, it was the hymnal of the church, really. Yeah. And doing this was a novelty at the time of the Reformation. So, you know, it's pointing this out and saying, well, it may be true that, you know, we have new translations of the Bible. We've moved on in some ways, but the principle, the pattern, the intention of the original is still there. It is to grow in Christ, to be grounded in the Word of God, and the prayer book is really the Bible turned into worship, you know, and connected like this, and trying to get people to see this. And especially at a time when in church life, we're facing a generation which is increasingly uneducated in these things.
Yes.
They may, even the people who go to church, they haven't been brought up with that deep knowledge of the Bible. And this is part of our culture. I'm not blaming anybody. This is just what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to go back to this,
Mm-hmm.
cultivating the memory, making people see that depth matters, and that it's what you absorb in your heart that stays there,
Mm-hmm.
and comes back to refresh you as time goes on.
Do you advocate? I've known a bunch of people over the years who will use the prayer book even for personal devotions. Most people use it in church for worship.
Yes.
Some people use it in their homes for personal devotions.
Yes.
What do you think about that? Is that a practice you commend?
Yes, I do commend that. Everyone should have practical, personal devotions of whatever kind, and it will be different for different people. I don't lay down the law. In our own church, when you are ordained, you undertake to use the prayer book as on a daily basis, which is what I do. And over the years, of the 40 plus years that I've been ordained, it's become part of me, in that respect. And it is a protection, if you like, because when things are going well in your life as a Christian, it doesn't really matter because you're sort of flying high and everything's all fine. But it's in the down times, when you're discouraged, when when you're doubting, when you've got problems, you need something to keep you going. You need a foundation. And it's in those times that something like this, that the investment pays off, shall we say. Yeah. It's like eating. I mean, I can't say that every meal I've had has been a marvelous experience. But on the other hand, that hasn't stopped me eating. Yeah. and if it is a good meal, well, I'm grateful, and you know what I mean. It goes like that. And I've got to the point now where if I miss my daily devotion from the prayer book for whatever reason, I'm flying overnight or something like that, things get out of kilter, I feel it as if I'd missed a meal. A physical meal.
Sure.
And that's a sign from the Lord, I think, that of how important this is, to come back to Him. And I mean, I'm not a fundamentalist in prayer book terms. I don't, idolize it and so on, but I use it as a tool, and really for my own I pray the prayer book, and then I go into my own private devotions from there. It's a kind of baseline, from on which to build a foundation, and I think that's what you have to do and have to understand it. And of course, the great thing about it is it keeps you balanced, because some people, they emphasize one thing, thanksgiving or the intercession or whatever. And I mean, that's all fine, but they're not balancing it off with other things. Whereas if you follow the prayer book, you are forced to be balanced. Oh. And that's very important.
Some great advice. Dr. Bray, we're about out of time. We always like to end our podcast interviews by asking our guests what God is doing in their lives these days, what God is teaching them these days, because we want to end on a note that is just forthrightly edifying for the people who are listening. So we ask you, what's God working on in your life these days? What's God doing or teaching you?
Well, there are many, many things. I think one thing that He's doing is teaching me to be patient, more patient. I'm by nature a very impatient person. I like to do things and get them done,
yes.
And so on. That's just me. And I'm learning, to hold back and say, well, God's timing is always right. And He will do what He's going to do when it's right to be done. not when I want it done, but when he wants it done. And really just to surrender my own thoughts and wishes and so on, of which I've got plenty, and ask him to sort of reconstruct my thinking, so that I'm on his wavelength rather than keep trying to force him to be on mine. And say, well, Lord, why aren't you doing this, that, or the other? I mean, I asked you already and you haven't done it yet.
Yes.
To sort of turn around and look at it the other way around. And I think that's, especially I think as growing older, and realizing that you're running out of time. I think that's a very important lesson to learn. That yes, I'm running out of time, I think, and so I want to hurry it up. I want to see it in my time, sort of thing.
Yes.
But that's not the way that God works. You plant a tree and the tree will outlive you, and you've got to do this. I mean, here we're sowing seeds at Beeson all the time, but when will they mature? I may not live to see it on this earth, but I'll see it from heaven. And having that faith to say, well, it doesn't depend on me. I mean, I'm a servant, and when I'm called to go home, well, that's it. I'm called to go home. I have to do what I'm told, and then I shall know. Even as Paul says, even as also I am known. Yeah. And, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. And as long as you stay on the principles, faith, hope, and love, and just, walk in faith, keep the hope going, and demonstrate as much love as you can as you do so, then you don't need to worry. The time will come. I will go, and God's work will continue.
Yeah. What a marvelous note on which to end. May the Lord help us all to grow in our aptitude for relying on His time and His grace, His provision, His providence in our lives. You have been listening to Dr. Gerald Bray. He is Research Professor of Divinity here at Beeson Divinity School, where he has served faithfully on the faculty for more than 3 decades. Please check out his new book, A Companion to the Book of Common Prayer. We commend it to you heartily, and we'll feature it when we post this podcast interview on our media channels as well. Thank you, Dr. Bray, for being with us. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We're praying for you. We ask you to continue to pray for the Lord's work here at Beeson Divinity School. And we say goodbye for now.
You've been listening to the Beeson Podcast, coming to you from the campus of Samford University. Our theme music is by Advent Birmingham. Our announcer is Mike Pasquarello. Our engineer is Rob Willis, and our show host is Doug Sweeney. For more episodes and to subscribe, visit beesondivinity.com/podcast. You can also find the Beeson Podcast on iTunes and Spotify.